Good morning, everybody. My name is Ewan Leach. I'm the Chief Executive of SURF, and I'd like to welcome you to the first of our People in Place network meetings. You're probably joining this because you've been part of the 20-Minute Neighbourhood practice network, and if you've been keeping up to date with our comms and our bulletin yesterday, there is an evolution of the 20-Minute Neighbourhood network. We've been discussing that for almost 2 years. It's probably slightly less than 2 years. I think our first meeting on this was September, almost 2 years ago. And the discussion has been rich, and we've heard a lot about 20-Minute Neighbourhoods as a policy concept, about what it means in practice, what academics think of it. But at the same time, we're aware that a lot of other policy issues have come into the arena around the same time, and there are also place-based policies. And I think community wealth building being one, local place plans. At our last event, there was a lot of questions towards the end of our meeting at the last event around local place plans. And so we've widened the network out into a network that really looks at how place-based policy works and how they all intersect with one another. And so over this year, we will be looking at place-based policies on a variety of topics. But this morning we are beginning with 20-Minute Neighbourhoods because the beginning of this year, obviously the adoption of the parliamentary adoption of National Planning Framework 4 meant that 20-Minute Neighbourhoods as a policy were formally adopted in Scotland, and more recently some further guidance has come out from Scottish Government, which is it's draft guidance and it's being consulted on. And so we are still talking about 20-Minute Neighbourhoods today, and over the next year we will no doubt still be mentioning 20-Minute Neighbourhoods, but specifically this morning on our agenda we have Ashley Mullen from Scottish Government introducing the draft planning guidance for local living in 20-Minute Neighbourhoods. So to have a presentation on that, followed by a Q&A. Then we'll have a comfort break as normal, and then what we have decided to do is Ashley will depart the meeting for 20 minutes, and we thought we would ask for some feedback from attendees this morning, because we will obviously be doing a response to the consultation, having spent a lot of time looking at 20-Minute Neighbourhoods over the past 2 years. It's an opportunity for people to share any thoughts with us, any frank thoughts that they maybe won't be putting into their own consultation, but we could maybe possibly put into our consultation response as to how you might be using them in a live setting, particularly if you're working in development control and you're using NPF4 and the policies within that. And so we'll have a sort of open discussion for 20 minutes. That section of this morning will not be recorded, but we will take notes and nothing will be attributable to anybody. We're not saying that anything contentious should be coming up in that 20 minutes, but it's just something that allows maybe a bit more freedom to have a discussion about any responses to the consultation. And then after that, Tim Moss, who works for Architecture and Design Scotland, but is not representing Architecture and Design Scotland this morning, is introducing some research that he's undertaken on community wealth building and how it works with the planning system. And I suppose I'm particularly interested in that because I think some of you may recall, well, I can recall Robbie Calvert's evidence to the Parliament last year around NPF4, and he said as a former development control officer, he wasn't sure how he would use community wealth building in the planning process. And so Tim's been doing some research on that, and so he's kindly agreed to share some of that research. There's a longer piece of research that will be published and we'll be sharing on our website in the near future. And we plan to close at 12:15 as usual this morning. Sorry for the late start, slightly late start. I had a problem as my PC did an update, which got me here only with 1 minute to spare. So that's it for this morning. Welcome you all. If you're not already on mute, I would recommend that you mute your cameras, mute your microphones, keep your camera on if you would like. And I would now like to hand over to Ashley Mullen. Thank you very much for coming and joining us, Ashley. But I'll hand over to you to share your presentation with us.
Thanks, Ewan. Hi, everybody. I'm just going to share my screen. Just give me a little second. Can you see that now, Ewan?
Yep, that's working fine.
Great. I'm just going to move everyone over here so that I can see my notes. And I'll go in here. Just checking it's can move okay, yep. Okay, hi there everyone. I'm Ashley Mullen. I'm a Senior Architect in the Planning, Architecture and Regeneration Division at the Scottish Government. I want to say thank you first of all to SURF and the People in Place Network for inviting me along today to speak about the Local Living 20-minute neighbourhood draft planning guidance. Apologies. This guidance is currently out for consultation, and we are really keen to hear from lots of you guys who are working in this sort of field. And you know, it's not a set in stone document. It's something that the consultation will very much inform, you know, the shaping of going forward. I appreciate also that much of this audience will have been part of the 20-minute neighbourhood practice network run by SURF. That's been incredibly helpful and informative for the development of the draft guidance. The insight that was offered by the presenters at those events has helped us to understand the area of challenges and action required to achieve local livability, and in particular the work of ANDS and Stewarton, which was a kind of case study for us too. It's also been a wonderful forum for understanding the place-based action that's been underway across Scotland before and since the phrase 20-minute neighbourhood came about. In writing the guidance, we also spoke to numerous local authorities and some community groups about the action they've been taking forward in trying to shape their communities to support local living. Some of this is reflected in the case studies in part 4 of the draft guidance, and we hope to thread more of these case studies through the guidance in the next iteration, so that we can help illustrate good place-based action. In September 2020, in response to the pandemic and the climate emergency, the Scottish Government included 20-minute neighbourhood ambition in the programme for government. The idea was that it's about where people can live well locally and meet their daily needs within a 20-minute walk, wheel or cycle from their home. Quite a simple concept really, and not one that's new to any of us. In setting out a commitment to 20-minute neighbourhoods, there was an increasing recognition that if we were to achieve our net zero targets, our ambitions around reducing inequality and improving health and well-being, we needed to adopt a green recovery route out of the pandemic and really radically rethink the way that we plan our places, how we live, our homes and our communities. Work within communities around 20-minute neighbourhood ambition has been supported already by the £325 million programme of place-based investment, and that's an ongoing investment, and this has been rolled out in partnership with COSLA. In 2020, we commissioned Climate Exchange to look at 20-minute neighbourhoods in the Scottish context. Through this research, Climate Exchange identified the opportunity for the concept of 20-minute neighbourhoods to support climate action, decreased health inequalities, improve local economy, improve livability and quality of life. These all also aligned with our national outcomes. There was a need to build on that and expand on the areas where the research suggested there needed to be more guidance. 20-minute neighbourhoods was also included in the draft NPF4, where the policy framework for local living has a home. The consultation and draft NPF4 gave us useful insight as to some of the questions that needed to be addressed within NPF4 or within the guidance. These included the provision of more detail around the concept, questions around delivery and resources for delivery, and concern that the concept is very urban and not suited to a rural context. In the guidance we've tried to tackle those questions. NPF4 that was adopted in February is now the Strategy Development Plan. It calls for new ways to consider and plan our places so that they support the creation of connected and compact neighbourhoods that prioritise and enable environmental, social and economic sustainability. So what about the guidance? Part 1 of the draft guidance explains the benefits of local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods to the climate and the environment, for health and well-being, for local economy and for quality of life. These ambitions align directly with those of NPF4. It looks at the policy context as part of the reform planning system and how NPF4 embeds local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods into decision making. This part explains how the delivery of NPF4 is supported by a wider programme of planning reform that will contribute towards local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods. The principles of local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods have also been embedded in a range of wider policy initiatives. These include Housing to 2040, the Town Centre Action Plan, the Retail Strategy for Scotland and the National Transport Strategy too. Part 1 of the guidance also explains the place context as a physical, social and economic context, and the importance of understanding the interrelationships between these elements as being central to delivering good places and successful local living. The way that local living operates will rely heavily on that place context. This means that irrespective of geography, the fundamental principles of planning and designing places to support good quality, sustainable access to facilities and promote meaningful social interaction. These priorities remain. The place principle is also discussed at this early stage in the guidance. The place principle provides the overarching policy context for place-based working by encouraging a participative approach to places. Lots of P's, services and infrastructure, land use and buildings, and the 6 qualities of successful places, which are the guiding principles underpinning the Scottish Government's approach to delivering good places. And the rural and island context needed to be addressed. The question of application in a rural setting was tackled in the revision of NPF 4. And Policy 15, which used to be Policy 7, emerged and became local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods. This was amended to reflect a more flexible approach, to 20-minute neighbourhoods through a wider emphasis on local livability. Research commissioned by Hightrans and undertaken by Nick Wright and Willie Miller Urban Design was well timed to inform what local living looks like in rural and island contexts. The research conducted around rural application included accounts from Loch Lomond and the National Park, Aberdeenshire Council, and from the Shetlands. This told us that local living can apply in a rural setting with a flexibility of approach and local input. It told us that where services and populations were widely dispersed, settlements can connect and create opportunities for networks of local places where daily needs can be met. Local living can be supported in rural places through planning for connected, attractive, sustainable places that respect the character and context, and crucially, with the involvement of the local community. So what does local living look like? Part 2, the guidance describes what local living 20-minute neighbourhoods look like in a Scottish context, and the objective to provide everyone with easy, sustainable and equitable access to the key facilities and services needed on a daily basis. In recognition that no 2 communities are the same and there is no tick list to determine what makes a place a 20-minute neighbourhood, the guidance deliberately avoids listing amenities and facilities. Instead, it provides a framework, the local living framework, to help structure conversations with communities around the daily needs of that community. The local living framework diagram is designed to reflect existing tools and resources for good placemaking. And you'll see the 14 themes of the Place Standard tool with the overarching categories from the place and wellbeing outcomes. Scotland, I believe, is the only country that's looking to promote the concept of local living in 20-minute neighbourhoods nationally. And therefore our diagram, the local living framework, is designed to reflect the diversity of our places and to help emphasise that local living is entirely place-based. It's unique to the circumstances and characteristics in a place, and therefore the facilities and amenities can't really be part of a predetermined list. The guidance goes on to provide some more detail around the key considerations of movement, space, resources, civic and stewardship that can help draw out the priorities for a place. And in Annex A at the very end of the document, it expands on this and provides additional information to support conversations and thinking around the categories in a local living framework. The Annex relays good design principles and considerations for good placemaking and good urban design principles. While the use of the core Place Standard tool is a great way to gather rich qualitative information about how people feel about their places, the guidance makes particular reference to the design version of the Place Standard tool. This version has been specifically created to help relate Place Standard themes throughout the development process. If we relate these themes through development planning and the development management and design processes, they can be referred to from inception right through design and construction to evaluation. The local living framework is intended as a quick reference diagram, while the Annex and the Place Standard tools have supporting information on what good looks like. It should be useful in identifying the daily needs of a community, as well as gathering baseline qualitative information. Slide 8, but part 3 of the guidance is where we introduce a structured approach to supporting local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods. The approach suggested in the guidance sets out 3 key steps that can be repeated for incremental change. Starting with gaining an understanding of the place and the coordination of all the information about a place, the approach then prompts us to look through the second step, which is to work collaboratively, easy for me to say, for place-based planning and design. The third step is about implementation and review, aligning investment, developing delivery capacity, and supporting new ways of working. Repeating this process incrementally helps us to achieve change over time, building in the ability to flex and adapt to shifting priorities. We can work through these steps with any scale project, whether that be at a strategic level when looking at development planning, where it can be referenced in the LDP evidence report and inform decisions about future development, or it can be carried out to inform smaller scale projects. It's a useful framework for identifying short, medium to long-term projects and identifying quick wins. In understanding the context of a place, data is an obvious starting point here, and we've heard lots of really excellent presentations on data and its use. Data in general can be used and is really helpful in establishing a baseline to move forward from. GIS data can tell us lots about the factors that are key to decision making, and we can layer and overlap specialist data like the SIMD data and other qualitative data to help build up the picture of a place. However, what we've tried to emphasise in the guidance is that quantitative data cannot be used alone, and that there needs to be a balance of both qualitative and quantitative data to build a true and accurate baseline for monitoring progress going forward and in the identification of those projects we spoke about earlier. It's more difficult to gather, but first-hand qualitative data that comes from lived experience and local knowledge can only enrich the understanding of a place and can shape decisions about a place. This sort of qualitative information can be gathered through tools like the Place Standard, giving you important information that can be used as part of that baseline and exercise. We also can't overlook the value of any previous community engagement exercises and their contribution to our understanding of a place. Many communities will have already been part of engagement about the future of their places. This might have been through community action plans, locality plans, or other community planning exercises. It could be as part of the local development plan or through some regeneration work such as town centre plans, area master plans, or community-led design processes. The results of previous community engagement exercises like these can form a valuable starting point for qualitative information on people's access to daily needs. It will also help the understanding of the aspirations of those people in that place, and it can help minimise duplication and cost. Step 2 is about collaboration, planning and designing and the coordination of the delivery partners, stakeholders and communities. This section of the guidance sets out how local living is now threaded through related strands of the planning system. It recognises the ideal placement of planning to gather that qualitative and quantitative information that informs local living, and that there's a thread that runs from community-led local place planning, capturing the aspirations of communities that can then be fed into the local development plan and the evidence report. There's a clear journey from local place plans that will capture the aspirations of communities and then be fed into the new generation of local development plans. And that can help focus investment in buildings and places that deliver sustainable and healthy communities. This section of the guidance also notes that the daily needs of people, they don't fit within one service, department or sector. Input is required from a broad range of stakeholders, and there needs to be cross-sector commitment to collaborative working. So successful local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods are a collaborative endeavour brought about through incremental change. We know that it takes everyone with a stake in a place to be involved in shaping that place. As a deliverable, it cuts across the whole gambit of council departments from green space, roads, education, housing, health and social care, planning, Local living, and that's not all, local living has to be at the forefront of the minds of everyone involved in a place, involving communities, stakeholders, and across the sectors. It's effectively a paradigm shift in the way that we think about our places and plan our places. It's a way of implementing the place principle and of bringing together strategies and investments that sit within silos that can bring about real place-based change. The paradigm shift comes from that shift in how we work together. There's a direct complementary alignment between planning and regeneration policy landscapes, with policies such as Infrastructure First and the Scottish Government's reaffirmed commitment to the Town Centre First principle. But what about those who actually deliver the buildings, the infrastructure, services and amenities? Cross-sector collaboration can help to identify those short, medium and long-term plans and projects, and it opens up community opportunities to combine investment to improve outcomes. For example, on an education project, are those commissioning the project speaking to housing about catchment areas and projected roles? Are they speaking to regeneration and maximising opportunities for co-benefits? Do they know about the Town Centre First principle? What about health and social care facilities or healthcare service planning within a community? A new hospital might be being delivered. In that future housing project, are there going to be anchor institutions that offer opportunities for community activities? And the design, density and layout, is the design, density and layout encouraging car dependency for basic journeys and our daily needs? Has a development been designed so that the children there can be educated and then undertake their hobbies in the evenings independently and within that community? Does that development have the services and range of housing to support people to age in place without putting pressure or added pressure on public services and our health services as a population ages? Are they considering the impacts of the new hospital or healthcare centre that they are planning on the outskirts of town and across a motorway? How about green space? Are they considering opportunities around sustainable urban drainage strategies or to improve footpaths to make them more accessible when undertaking their works? Can we coordinate and work collaboratively to deliver on our national outcomes? Step 3 of this process or approach is about implementation and review and the coordination of investment pots, opportunities and knowledge and expertise so that we can achieve some of those project outcomes. It's about recognising the knowledge and skills that one sector might have that the others don't, or the expertise, resources and funding that the different partners can bring to the table. And it's about sharing resources and capacity for delivery, combining and coordinating investment plans and opportunities to maximise the benefits of local living. It's basically about getting everybody with a stake in that place around a table and pulling together the resource that's there. To support this local living is further bolstered with the alignment of a number of cross-government policies, strategies and investments. These can support the delivery of local living and include NPF4, the Place-Based Investment Programme, the Empowering Communities Programme, Town Centre Action Plan and Town Centre First Principle, Community Wealth Building, Housing to 2040, Climate Action Towns, the Infrastructure Investment Plan, Investment for Active Travel and the Work Local Challenge Programme. So we're doing our best to try and make everyone sort of work together across those portfolios to achieve local living. One of the most important parts about the structured approach is the recognition that good placemaking is incremental. We suggest that repetition of this approach helps to bring about the incremental change. It helps develop actions that bring about co-benefits and supports community wealth building and helps to achieve our national outcomes. Everyone involved in making decisions about a place should ensure that the actions informed by considering the wider impacts and capturing co-benefits. Through the revisiting and updating the assessment of the context, the data gathered and taking account of this will help with the understanding of where further action is required. However, successful local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods are a collaborative endeavour brought about through incremental change. The delivery of local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods does not sit neatly within one service, as I've also already said, and we know that it takes everyone with a stake in a place to be involved in shaping that place and building strong, resilient communities that improve quality of life, whatever the geography can be achieved. It requires us to work to the place principle. It requires us to eradicate silo working and align investment, development, delivery capacity and resources. I would encourage everyone to please respond to the consultation and help shape this guidance. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ashley. That was great. A nice overview of where we started and where we've come, and thank you for recognising the benefits of the network. And I know that some of the work of the network is referenced in the supplementary guidance. So that's very nice to see that SURF has been useful, and service networks primarily have been useful in developing this. You mentioned Stuart, and we hope at some point to have a presentation about what the work that ANDS did in Stuart, and it was maybe going to be today, but it's been delayed because we think that is actually an interesting model to have a look at, a whole place approach in the collaborative way that you've kind of highlighted in your presentation. And I also thought that in your presentation, the whole incremental change, it's important that we, I suppose, talk about that more. I've been approached by the press recently around 20-minute neighbourhoods on the back of the consultation. And what's interesting is the journalists are asking questions about developments they're seeing currently on site, and they're able to identify that they're not 20-minute neighbourhoods. So there's something happening, and that's not, and it's like, well, no, the policy started now, so that arguably it may be applied in a different form under previous planning policy, but it's going to take time for us to see that. And I suppose particularly for our existing places, if they're not currently well serviced or walkable and livable, it will take time for them to change if they can change through planning development and through different service provision. It's open to the floor for questions. I have a question first. I suppose one of the things that one of my interests around the 20-minute neighbourhood and looking at it in other countries where density is talked about a lot in other countries. Melbourne, it's about re-densifying Melbourne, a very low density city. And then looking at some of the models of 20-minute living abroad, Paris, Barcelona, they have 50,000 people per square kilometre living, and in the densest parts of Scotland, we have about 16,000 people living. So even our densest places, they're not as dense as those major cities. But one of the things you mentioned was that we're interested in respecting existing character, and I've wondered if there's a conflict there. So if existing character is low density and car centric, that is the existing character, how we respond to that?
Good question, Ewan. I think that my answer to that would be it would have to be done very sensitively and with bringing the community along with you. One of the things about the local living framework and the place standard tool in general is that it has that added element of telling you what is understood to be good and why. And I think that, if a place is car centric, it wasn't always car centric. It will have had some kind of history there where cars weren't so much of a dominating factor. And yeah, there are places that maybe don't have a lot in terms of existing sort of heritage or sort of obvious cultural kind of connections, and I guess new places would come under that banner as well. And I suppose it's about how you want to create that and designing around centres. The other thing is as well with rural populations where density just tackling that sort of density angle, where density doesn't necessarily sort of fit the traditional model of 20-minute neighbourhoods or 15-minute cities or anything like that. There is an element of local in rural places, a massive, probably more so than a lot of other sort of more urban communities. And a lot of these places, what we found in lots of the research is they're already working together as communities. They might be dispersed, but they all kind of, they can join together to become networks of with the elements that or the features for their daily lives. It's a difficult one, but it has to be, however it is done, the focus needs to be on, I think, on local living and promoting the ability and to access facilities and to have those facilities. I mean, if the facilities aren't there in the first place, you're never going to access them. So that's kind of first and foremost, I suppose. And the access to those facilities is key to that. Rural communities, I guess, just need to work together and sort of figure out what works for them. I don't know if I have the answer for that.
Well, I mean, when we did work with Scottish Rural Action, some of their responses were, obviously, expectation if you live rurally is not the same as if they don't expect to have a hospital within half an hour or even an hour of where they live, and that, you know, that may be why they live rurally, and they don't expect certain services to be. So there are different expectations if you're living rurally. So it's good that the living locally is a wide application. So thinking about densification, that Cash had a housing event a couple of weeks ago, and from the floor, one of the observations was existing communities are resistant to change, and sometimes when we're maybe looking at new denser development, that can particularly get people's backs up. But if it's close to particularly public transport, and I suppose I'm thinking actually in my head, I'm thinking of Longniddry in East Lothian, which has a train station and has an extension to the town, deeply opposed by the community. And I know that the extension of that extension will have, and it's just what I think it won an award at the Housing Awards last week. It should be dense because it's beside a train station, and so it requires a different mindset. It requires collaborative work across key agencies, but it also, I suppose, requires a different thinking from the public. But we have some questions have come in, so I will take David Lees. You had your hand up first. If you want to unmute.
Thanks, Ian, and thanks, Ashley, for your presentation. I'm sure you'll be aware of billionaire Tom Woods's energy transition zone plan to seize a third of St Vitick's Park in Torry in Aberdeen. It's a treasured green space in a working class community who in the last decade have had their sea view walled off, a sewage treatment plant built, a landfill site and a waste incinerator within 500 metres of the town. So post NPF4, Jim Fitzpatrick has green lighted this recent land grab. My question is, how can communities be expected to take the 20-minute neighbourhoods, local living and NPF4 seriously when government action stands in complete contradiction to what the framework sets out? For example, where is the funding for ground-up local place plans, and where are the commitments that planning decisions will be made on the basis of these recommendations?
I'm not. So to tackle your first, there was a few questions in there, I think. So the first one was about the development and what you called the land grab in Aberdeenshire, was it? It's difficult for us to speak about previous sort of planning sort of issues that are being dealt with through that local authority and that planning sort of process that existed before NPF4. What I can say is that the hope is that, you know, through this new way of working through NPF4 and through local living 20-minute neighbourhoods, is that the community-based action forms quite a strong position, and that people can't then, that it can't be kind of overturned. It kind of represents the democratic process for elected members and you know, ministers to look at and sort of, you know, understand that that's not what communities want. I can't speak about the case individually. I don't know of it, and I don't know of any of the details. When it comes to local place planning, we are currently working on looking at how we go about supporting communities to that effect, and supporting communities to take forward the local living and 20-minute neighbourhoods sort of agenda through place-based working within their own sort of communities. I'm not sure that I've really answered your question. I don't know if you want to maybe contact us offline about it, and we can maybe have a chat about that later.
David probably brings something up that, I mean, to me, it is the kind of gift of the 20-minute neighbourhood. And I think when we began talking about this, my concern was about it coming back to bite us in the future, or decision makers in the future, because I think it is a concept that people can, although it's complicated, people can get their heads around it. And so when they see something happening that isn't a 20-minute neighbourhood, which is the just that have approached me, they can identify that something is damaging to their local neighbourhood. So I think it will be interesting to see how this pans out. I think in both public and political understanding of what the delivery of this means. My feeling is that it should tighten up what was existing planning policy.
Yeah, I mean, I share a lot of the frustrations. What you know, I go around the place I live in, and I think, why has that been given permission? And you know, and people ask me about local living, and they're like, well, how come they've built that new housing development and it doesn't have any facilities? You know, and it's difficult, but we are looking at it. You know, in the civil service, we are kind of looking at that and trying to come up with ways of dealing with that.
We have thank you, David. Tough one for you. We have a question before Jonathan Giddings. I'll come to you next, but there's a question from Nick Wright in the chat, because it was really good to hear you talking about collaborative working. And I think what Nick's saying is it's not about planning. Delivery of 20-minute neighbours will not be delivered solely through the planning system. But the collaborative of investment in services, education, health, which you listed actually one of your very good questions that you gave in your presentation, Ashley. But he's asking, is there anything in the pipeline from the government and key agencies to make that happen, to make that sort of collaborative working within places?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the work of Stewarton was, in direct relation to work with key agencies, and was really helpful and informing in that. And actually, it might answer some of the other questions that were asked in terms of, what happens with a new community and an expansion of a community. Stewarton's a community, I don't want to take away from the NDS presentation, but it's a commuter belt town that, needed to expand. But there was opportunities that we'd kind of brought to the table about potential densification of the town centre, and only allowing expansion if there's connections with public transport and things like that can kind of generate conversations, and I think that the NDS model will tell us a lot, and we'll be able to use that to support that process. Again, this is the next stage of what we're doing now. So we've had NPF4 that's been adopted in Parliament, and we're in the stages now of delivering on the sort of guidance that needs to support NPF4. So we've had this local living 20-minute neighbourhood planning guidance, and we've had LDP guidance as well. So the series of guidances will come out, and there will be implementation and sort of how do we review kind of work going forward.
Yeah, I suppose in some ways it comes, I think when draft NPF4 came out, and actually throughout the discussion of NPF4, RTPI were often looking at Ireland's approach to the adoption of a national planning policy and about where it sits within government, and it should be sitting with the First Minister, so that all the aspects of government fit into it, and that would then cascade down to local government, where the planning system should be the thing that is understood about place-based working.
Yeah. I mean, I would, on a personal level, and I'm sure the NPF4 team and my planning colleagues would urge everyone to try their best to get NPF4 up that chain and let everyone read it, because it's a really good sort of strategic document for you know, for a council to set up their, you know, their entire kind of, you know, development framework around, and would absolutely encourage that. And it is part of the place principles. You know, NPF4 covers so many different aspects that feed into the planning of our places, and that, you know, it kind of would tell everyone, all right, okay, that's where I fit. Oh, I fit in there, and that's where my work fits. And I spoke in my presentation about, you know, getting everyone round the table and using the policy framework that we've provided in the government as well, that, you know, that's got local living embedded within it, to kind of almost bash heads together and say, right, okay, you've got funding for that, and we need to do that. Can we pull it together and make it a combined project? And, you know, it's just about thinking differently, working differently.
Jonathan, you had a question. You had your hand up.
Thank you. Firstly, Ashley, thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. It really sort of was very easy to follow and really clear. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I'm a regeneration officer working in Govan, and I think this is going to be really useful in terms of the way in which we develop our projects. We're being much more collaborative, and I wanted to really pick up on some of the things that Ewan has just said. You know, being collaborative for us is key to being successful and also being relevant. So I think the guidance is going to really help people like me in terms of developing projects that we do, which we deliver in partnership with other agencies. But in terms of the funding side of it, you know, to have a much more structured, perhaps, approach and be able to refer to a process which actually makes real sense, you know, in the way in which you delivered it. So thank you very much for that, really. And I really look forward to the publication of the document. And I live about 2 minutes from Stewarton, and I'm telling you, I don't know what's been going on there, but it's becoming so much more vibrant. So things are working well. Because the high street is really vibrant. There's new shops opening, new local businesses opening. We've got a wonderful new development of housing just around the corner. Great GP service. So yeah, you're doing something right. So thank you very much for that.
I can't quite take credit for that, but I appreciate your kind comments.
Mary Donaghy has a question.
Hi, Ashley. Thanks very much.
Hi, Mary.
Within Scottish Futures Trust, we've been leading work around town centre living, which I appreciate is slightly wider or slightly narrower than you're focusing on local living. But I'm wondering about, and it's linked to the you talked about, you know, local living as a central focus for 20-minute neighbourhoods, but also the need to align delivery funding and delivery pots. How do we get more town centre living, local living, when the focus housing targets are still driven by volume delivery and housing grants are still driven by volume delivery, which is driving the volume house builders? So within our report, I mean, we've got a whole bunch of recommendations, and we've got Scottish Government regeneration and housing involved in the work. But one of the key things come out from our work is the need to recognise a shift, I guess, from affordable housing to affordable living, which takes away a whole bunch of additional costs, timing costs for people to get to the place and the things that they need to get to, but also the need to shift the project appraisal to include wider metrics around the costs of projects and the benefits of projects. So some costs that we don't necessarily see directly if we're building out in the countryside, both in terms of the infrastructure, the road infrastructure costs, the air quality costs, the time cost that it takes for public services to get to these places, even if it's things like bin emptying and cleansing services, these sorts of things that we don't ever take account of within our project appraisal techniques, which would drive us completely down towards that sort of local living, town centre living as the priority and the best long-term investment opportunity. So it was a bit of a ramble, but I think there were some questions in there about how we try to recognise some of this wider stuff.
Yeah, no, I'm not sure I'll be able to directly answer all the different parts of the questions that you've asked there, but yeah, I mean, I think that with working collaboratively, it's an opportunity to kind of have those conversations and say, you know, listen, you're proposing this suburban development out in the sticks, and it's supposed to interact with our town centre, but actually it doesn't have any amenity. You're locking in car dependency. And as you say, it actually, I mean, I actually have a really good YouTube article, and it talks about the cost of suburban development to, you know, to society. You know, and actually it says something like, you know, a lot of suburban developments would need to be paying something in the region of £8,000 a month in council tax to cover the costs of where they live and the infrastructure that's had to be put in place to have that development. And I think that the decisions going forward should be made around the best value of you know, public money, and, you know, is that the best way to develop? And I get that we have to kind of we have to provide housing, and not everyone wants to live in high density housing, but if our town centres or our neighbourhood centres are really vibrant places and really you know, places where people want to be, then I feel as if naturally people will want to live a little bit closer to that and be able to access that. Might be a bit of a pipe dream. And I'm not sure how we shift the private housing landscape. I mean, yeah, I don't know. It's a difficult problem. I think that we can only just keep promoting the benefits of local living and the benefits of sort of having centres and what they bring to communities, and the hope that it doesn't happen.
Yes,
A bit vague.
yes, but it's beyond private housing. It's also the council housing and housing association delivery, and it's the affordable grant supply programs that are funding these sorts of things, and the level of grants that are available, because they are not recognising the wider benefits of what we're getting and the costs of alternative developments. But it's a much bigger issue, and I don't want to take up the rest of the space today.
That's okay, thank you.
But it's a good point, because I think one of the other questions actually from Peter Node, I think, was around how we get the private sector to adopt this. I mean, interestingly, I would say the private sector are, because you'll see private sector housing developments advertising themselves as, this is a 20-minute neighbourhood, because it's the flavour of the month. It's not a 20-minute neighbourhood, but they're using it as a branding exercise. And I think certainly in our response to the draft consultation, that will be something we'll be raising. And I think the only way that the private housing industry will change where they deliver, where they want to deliver, is if planning policy does not allow them to do that. And I suppose that comes back to how firm will the application of the policy be at a local level, with the backup of obviously Scottish Government if it comes to appeals or call-ins as well. On the back of actually what you and Mary have just been talking about, one of the other questions was regarding public transport and whether or not you've been able to have, because in a rural setting, research at Dundee University and the conversations we had with Scottish Rural Action, and I suppose other work that we've done around, I suppose, semi-rural towns in the central belt, is the importance of public transport to deliver living well locally. And the challenges of public transport being reduced as a result of dropping numbers through COVID, etc. Have you been able to have conversations, because this is sometimes not just a issue or a local planning issue, it's a wider Scottish transport issue. Have you had any conversations with colleagues within the Scottish Government about how they or their funding can support living well locally?
Yeah, I mean, lots of certainly when I first joined the government and was, you know, given 20-minute neighbourhoods as my policy area, it kind of sat with transport originally, and it became quite clear that, you know, this isn't, while it's something that, you know, transport's extremely important in this argument, and actually I think one of the underpinning factors, it is a kind of planning and urban design and architecture type thing, so it kind of came to us, but yeah, I do have regular conversations with planning colleagues. They tend to be transport colleagues. It tends to be around the idea of the 20% car kilometre reduction and the route map for that, and we again, this is part of the kind of implementation and delivery going forward. We have some sort of working groups set up to look at how we can do that. It is something that I'm very conscious of, that, you know, without, as I say, without the transport element being, you know, workable, then it's not really going to, you're not going to get people out of cars. And you're not going to, you know, promote that sustainable travel. But we can still do place-based action, and we can still start to deliver those place-based action without the transport being in place. So you know, it doesn't need one for the other to happen, but it does need one for the full success, if you like, of that model. Yeah, it's part of our implementation work right now that we're looking at this.
I think because we did one of the 20-minute neighbourhood events we had was with Scottish Government Transport around the 20% reduction. I mean, I suppose an interesting to that was there is no budget to make that happen. And to me, even you know, I'm very interested in the effects of advertising on our lives, and we are bombarded with advertising that encourages us to buy cars, and the freedom. Interestingly, a lot of car advertising now is women driving. It's the same as, you know, we use women to encourage smoking at the beginning of the 20th century. We said it was for freedom and liberty to smoke, and turned out it wasn't. And there's a similar drive around. There's a similar, pun intended, drive around cars, but we don't seem to have the budgets to kind of counteract that sort of level of information deluge that we're covered in. Which comes to us, well, Michael Ward has given a question which you probably guess what the answer is. And he's talking about the gap between policy and deliveries being large, the absence of funds within local authorities. Glasgow's probably not getting any levelling up funding in the last round. I think there were numerous applications from Glasgow. Obviously, that's a UK government issue, but he's looking at the fact that core funding is competitive, and that's obviously time-consuming in itself. But discussion within government of moving away from that to kind of improve the funding to deliver this sort of to deliver 20-minute neighbourhoods. I don't know if you have any comment on that, because it's a wider government. But when you work for government, you'll get questions about all of government, and obviously you're not a politician, but I don't know if you have any observations on that.
Yeah, no, I mean, certainly it was one of the first questions I asked, you know, what is there money to do this? It was one of the questions that came out through NPF4 as well, you know, what about resources? And presumably that means not only people resources, but financial resources. And the answer to that is that no, I don't know of any funding that is specifically related to this other than the place-based investment programme. And that is also, you know, divvied up amongst the applicants across various councils and communities. And I guess that's why we're trying to emphasise the benefit of working to the place principle, where, and I know it sounds really woolly, but a lot can actually be achieved by pooling those resources together. And I'll give you a perfect example. In one of the interviews that we had when we were writing the guidance, and I should say, by the way, that Nick Wright and Innes Tribell from Willie Miller Urban Design also contributed, and they were consultants on the writing of the guidance. But one of the interviews that we conducted, they said to us that they were using active travel funding to deliver local living, and you know, they spoke about a park, for example, that was on the edge of this, and how the active travel funding couldn't then be used for this park, and so that park would have to sit there and not. And my question was, well, if you've spoken to your green space department, you know, might they be able to pull funding together? Might they be able to apply for a, you know, some kind of grant or whatever? Have you spoken to the cultures team? Do they have something that they could, you know, create artwork within that park? And I mean, I know that sounds like a kind of government-esque kind of woolly response. I only say that because it comes from a place of having worked in local authority and having a role where you had to work to pull those strands together to get the right outcomes. And I'm not sure saying it's going to work every time, but I do think that there's a lot of value in working to the place principle and pulling those resources together and getting people and actually using some of the policy framework to say, well, actually, you've got a policy that aligns with your work stream, and it says that you're supposed to be looking at local living. So can we use your budget? You know, that kind of thing.
It's challenging, but yes, these are practical ways of doing it, but it does remain challenging in straitened times. We're about to sort of have a bit of a break, comfort break. Before we finish with the comfort break, in terms of the feedback that you're looking for from government, is there anything specific that you would like from the audience? I mean, I think the audience today there's a lot of local authority staff online today. Is there anything that in the formal feedback that you are particularly looking for that would be helpful?
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the reasons why I spent quite a bit of time around the structured approach and the local living framework is because I think that they are the points that we need people to tell us if they work or not, or if they're usable. It would be really useful to get feedback on that and you know, hear what people have to say, and we can hopefully then feed that into working up those models and you know, improving them and making sure that they do what we want them to do. I'm glad that Jonathan earlier had said that you know, he felt he could use it, because that's always the worry, that you've come up with this kind of approach and actually it's people go, what are you I can't use that. So yeah, I'd like to hear about these approaches in particular. And the local living framework, again, it reaches across the place standard, and the place standard has lots of, you know, resources and materials. Our own website, ourplace.scot, has a lot of resources as well that can help, but particularly the methods and the approaches within the guidance. I would appreciate feedback on those.
Okay, thank you very much, Ashley.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for your presentation and for the time that you have given us this morning. There's obviously is a high amount of interest, and there will continue to be a high amount of interest in the topic. We're about to go for a break. We're slightly over, so we'll come back just after 11:10. The next session, so we'll have 15 or 20 minutes discussion about potential responses to the consultation that Ashley has referred to, where you can all come in with any thoughts that you might like SURF to take on board in our response to the consultation. And then we'll start the recording again at 11:30. We'll come back, I think you're coming back at 11:30, Ashley, to hear Tim Moss's presentation. But if you all want to take a break just now, and we'll give Ashley a round of applause. Thank you very much, Ashley. And see everybody again at 11:10. So welcome back, everybody, and thank you for the contributions that we've had so far. Thank you very much to Ashley, and we are now moving on. We're sticking on a bit of a planning theme today, but community wealth building was something that we had hoped to look at in more depth last year as an organisation. We did a conference on it, but we didn't do much more than that. But we're hoping that the opening up of this network allows us to bring community wealth building into as a topic. And by coincidence, I was made aware of some research that was done recently by Tim Moss. And so I invited Tim Moss to share some of that research. So to basically to present a sort of overview of the research that he's done on community wealth building. And for us to have a bit of a Q&A, and we will be able to share the research after this. We'll publish it on our website. So Tim, I will invite you to start your presentation and tell us a bit about the genesis of where this came from. Over to you, Tim.
Cheers. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Excellent. So thanks for inviting me, and thanks for Ashley earlier for presenting some stuff that's had some linkages in the work that will be covered here as well. So basically about 18 months ago, I was awarded the RTPI Practitioner Research Fund, which is there to carry out independent research out with my organisation. And so the findings here are basically a result of that, which was my attempt to basically understand the sort of community wealth building and place-based context in Scotland, both over the sort of last 18 months as it's developed and what's, I assume, coming forward. So this is the first time any of us have seen any actual sunlight. So, you know, if there's any shortfalls, I hope that the questions and answers section will bring out potentially some shortfalls in the research that I can act on. And yeah, as Ewan's already said, it's going to be published very soon. But if you have any questions after which, my emails are at the end. Yeah, so the aims of today are basically to be looking at the policy context of behind the upcoming Community Wealth Building Bill, but also what's been going on at a local authority level already and at Scottish Government. The aim is to sort of see how those things interact, but also to set out some of the recommendations that the report gives. But yeah, firstly, I just wanted to briefly touch on some of the tiny misconceptions that sort of came through in the surveys and the interviews that I gave from some of the basically the idea of the Preston model, the idea of the community wealth building came about, obviously has its origins with the sort of Preston City Council and earlier in the US, but it's never just been a procurement strategy. The element of planning has always been present within the approach, as you can see pictured here by the RTPI Excellence nominated Preston.
Tim, can I interrupt? Sorry. You've not shared your presentation with us.
Oh, for God's sake!
So we're looking at you, and it's great.
But, right, okay.
You did say it's been a while since you've done a presentation.
It's been a while since I've never used it before, so I kind of.
It was interesting enough, but when you referred to something that we needed to look at, I better tell you.
Yeah, so we're off to a good start, and so
that's it. It's working now. We've got it. We're on your first screen. Thanks
so
very
much.
That
was what was there before what you were supposed to have seen, and that was what you were supposed to have seen a minute ago. And that's the nice picture of Preston markets. But basically, the thing I was trying to get across is that community wealth building as a strategy is intended to be a municipalist movement. It's about decentralizing power to communities, building and retaining agency in its area. So that's hopefully what the bill and sort of these measures should in theory achieve, which obviously there's a debate for. Yeah, so in Scotland you can kind of see this as a sort of a mixture, the sort of embrace of community wealth building you can kind of see as a mixture of two strands of policy making. First, there's a kind of community empowerment and land reform agenda, which sort of aim to build, repopulate the sort of rural communities and improve resilience in that area. And secondly, there's kind of an embrace of more community-led types of regeneration, which are more historically urban, municipal, and cooperative led. So the first mention of community wealth building actually was by Derek Mackay in 2018, but that was just off the last parliamentary session. And then in the new one, we've seen the rollout of the place-based investment programme, which was the Ayrshire Growth Deal, the Glasgow Growth Deal. There's a bunch of other stuff that was mentioned in Parliament as being linked to it, but these are kind of the three main prongs you can see on the screen. And now we're sort of seeing the consultation of the Community Wealth Building Bill. So what the bill's proposed so far has been a duty for all statutory bodies to advance community wealth building through either a plan or through something that to include community wealth building within their plan, whole corporate plan, that's what I'm trying to say, sorry. There's also a recommendation for a series of non-statutory approaches and guidance, and in the third part of the consultation is a kind of blanket feedback request for legislative barriers to overcome, which many of the sort of, I've tried to read as many of the consultations as I could, but this was kind of after my research was completed. But it's obviously quite a blank slate. So I've tried to look for what RTPI have said, and it's been I noticed it was a lot of the things that they were asking for in sort of Planning Act consultations. DTAS, for instance, were calling for more clearance around compulsory purchase and sales orders, for instance. So it remains to be seen, and it's very unclear what feedback's going to come from it. And I hope if anyone wants to bring that up in the comments in the Q&A afterwards, I'd love to hear what they've responded by. But yeah, so moving on, we have NPF4, which is the first national planning document to mention community wealth building, and has provided this really handy, but if a bit vague, definition of what it actually is going to mean to planning. But you can still see how the community wealth building kind of breaks down in sort of the different sections within it. On a national development level, there's this aim that the goals will be achieved here. In the earlier version of the document, they were asking for people to fulfill procurement goals around community wealth building here, but that's been removed, presumably because it wouldn't be possible under planning. There's also in the National Spatial Strategy, it sets out what the community wealth building priorities mean within different locales. So, for instance, in the northern coastal areas, you've got a kind of aim to strengthen the transition away from oil producing industries. You've also got Central Belt, a sort of rebalancing of the local economy. Yeah, and so the sort of newest bit of guidance we've had is around local development plans in the recently published guidance, which I've put in here. And basically that ties in a lot with the kind of Ashley's earlier espousing of the sort of qualitative angle of LDPs. So similarly to the way that 20-minute neighborhood evidence is needed, there's also in the evidence report, there'll be a requirement that LDPs must take into account community assets, community wealth building priorities as they've been written anywhere, any areas of economic disadvantage, any existing and emerging community-led plans. And so this is possibly where one of the sort of key intersections between LDPs and local place plans might emerge. So moving on to local authority policies and what's been going on during the time I was researching this. I carried out a review of any mentions of community wealth building policy that was up to August 2022. So if your favourite community wealth building mention isn't referenced to here, I'm sorry. There's also, I also carried out a survey of 233 local authority staff from over 30 local planning authorities. I meant to thank some of the people here who actually did contribute towards that at the beginning, so thank you. And there was a number of interviews which some of the people here did take part in, and again, thank you for that. What I found in the review was that most authorities had written something. Those mentions were usually, there was at least some mention, but that mention usually was referring to the kind of place-based investment program or the city deal funding. But 17 of the authorities had made some kind of actual policy commitment. Within that, the sort of majority of those would reference approaches such as land use audits or procurement practice approaches and that kind of thing. But even within that, there was a small amount of about 7 authorities who had published specific community wealth building plans, which you can see in this nice collage I've gathered. But yeah, here aims to give a tiny taste of the work that I was reviewing. But within that, I then tried to cluster the sort of different mentions that referred to the sort of the pillar around land and assets, and to try and understand what was actually going on in each area. And so these are the 6 sort of clusters as I saw them. You've got using council assets for social goods, working with anchor institutions, engaging with community investment strategies, community ownership approaches more generally, then there's also aspects of green local construction and community-led housing. The latter two were more aspirational in a lot of cases, but I'll go over that in more detail just now. So for land and property for common good, that strand of work, it often involved things like finding uses for stored spaces through maybe food growing initiatives. There's also pop-up shops like the one that I've pictured here from Renfrewshire Council. Yeah, so mainly there's sort of a lot of good work going on here. It's basically about taking, there's a wider context of retail contracting, which one of the interviewers pointed out. So there's an increasing level of supply of land that needs to be used for more social good in that sense. Yeah, sorry. And so we've also got this kind of approach to working with local community anchors around an embracing the place principle approach. Work that's gone on here has been sort of these holistic master planning strategies or community plan approaches that councils have taken. One of the sort of good practices I found was the Alpha Pathfinder initiative, which I'm a little bit nervous about going into too much detail because some of the grant backs is on the line. But my organisation has worked with Client Manager on this, and it was sort of a very good approach at taking community engagement workshops and that sort of thing and aligning it with the sort of goals and the strategies of the key organisations in that area. Yes. So one of the other ones I found again was sort of local-led investment strategies. This is kind of one of the sort of key sort of areas of this is sort of participatory budgeting, sorry, which is something that's been quite, like most of this stuff has been quite a force within community-led planning in Scottish Government well before community wealth building was ever mentioned as a policy objective. But I'm mentioning it here because of sort of a lot of the place-based approaches that some of these strands of work take. For instance, in Perth and Kinross Council, who have managed to fulfil over 436 community wishes. A lot of the work they did was in conjunction with contractors that they procured who did work in a lot of construction. A lot of them worked in construction, sorry. And so they also took a sort of quite place-based approach to how they would dish out the funding. And yeah, in turn, a lot of it resulted in a lot of the place-based policy that they've carried out. Sorry, one sec. So one of the other areas is sort of community asset transfers and sort of community ownership approaches. This area is quite, was seen as attracted a lot of debate within the people that I spoke to. Ultimately, it is a key part of the community wealth building mix, and it's cited in a lot of strategies like the LDP guidance that I mentioned earlier does mention any kind of community asset transfers as part of the evidence report for community wealth building. There are a lot of well-documented issues around good practice in this, with sort of largely voluntary community groups taking on board potentially difficult to manage assets. But there has been a lot of good practice here, and mainly as long as this is tied in with increased supply of council assets to run and manage, then it can be part of a good mix of redistributing land for social good, which is one of the sort of key areas of community wealth building. Moving on to this area. So this is something that was mentioned in a lot of the strategies that the Centre for Local Economic Strategies, the reports that they did on behalf of some of the local authorities as I read. For instance, there was a mention of taking the Green Jobs Fund that Scottish Government had put out and using it to support a sort of green economy transition to help build a sort of industry around passive house standard buildings. The issue is that a lot of the work that's going on at this point is quite either very centralized, like the work that you see with Home Energy Scotland, or it's very sort of carried out with the council. It's also, there is some stuff like meet the real buyer events where people are sort of aligned with local contractors. People align local contractors with local authority departments to encourage greater collaboration. But there's clearly a lot more focus and work that should be going on at this level. Some of the good, pardon me, some of the good practice that you can see here, according to some of the people I interviewed, it can be in the sort of combined authorities work in England. Some of the ones, such as Manchester's GMCA, took a approach to sort of place-based and holistic approach, where they aim to renovate 887,000 buildings and upskill 80,000 workers. I've also pictured Niddry Road here because I think it's an excellent example of what work can be done and what sort of innovative approaches can be carried out. Yeah, the final sort of key cluster that I saw is the community-led housing approaches. There's clearly a sort of, as mentioned earlier by a lot of the people today, particularly Mary's comment about a lot of the grants being focused on volume delivery in rural areas. There's clearly a different approach that needs to be taken here, and this is a strand that will affect our ability to build community wealth, because it was cited by a lot of people that were surveyed as there's an issue retaining labour in areas where there's housing shortfalls. There's an issue increasing footfall when people don't live in town centres, and there's limits, of course, to service delivery, as mentioned earlier. And so some of the innovative approaches that are already going on is where community groups try and link with those anchor institutions who need those, who need to attract employees. And there's also, so mid-steeple quarters is a good example of where community-led regeneration can hopefully regenerate areas of central Dumfries, which I can't really do justice to in this slide, but here you go. So before I get on to one of the sort of other key parts of the research I carried out, I just thought I'd touch on, which is the survey results that I carried out. I thought I'd briefly just touch on the sort of caveats that it was a survey of 233 people, which is not necessarily, may not necessarily be representative of the 10,000 odd, however many thousand local authority staff that there are in Scotland. But at the end of so the work carried out throughout 2022, and I aim to try and benchmark some of the perceptions that staff had against the the findings of attitudes to land reform, which was carried out by Ipsos Mori and the SRUC. So one of the first key findings I wanted to show you today is about the kind of link that are made between authorities that had a sort of developed council-wide commitment to a community wealth building and ones that were more doing, had mentioned it within a sort of funding investment document. There is a sort of substantial difference in the level of awareness across staff if you don't have that kind of policy action commitment. The other bits of the sort of, there are some noted gaps between the sort of public and staff around issues to do with place-based approaches. For instance, there was a noted, and this is just something that was worth being aware of, that sort of difference in perception. For instance, vacant and derelict land was sort of notably a less obvious issue to members of the public than it was to the staff that I surveyed. And also, there's also a key sort of difference in rural areas between sort of level of support for community land stewardship in rural areas and urban ones, or at least that's what sort of came up in the research. And finally, there's a sort of key difference between the sort of big three players, service departments, sorry, in terms of their sort of awareness in community wealth building and sort of the rest of the departments that I surveyed, sorry. So you can kind of see on this graph that economic development, planning and building, and community planning are all quite high on here, but whereas when you get to sort of other council roles and sort of transport and roads, there is quite a lower level of awareness around community wealth building. To try and create this, to try and embed that approach, you would need to get all people on side, which is why I've been a bit cheeky and took a quick screenshot of one of Ashley's slides here. For this sort of process for incremental change to work, this level of awareness needs to be across the board. So before I go into questions, I just thought I'd sort of sum up the recommendations that the report made. I set out in the report to enact this place-based approach. We have a need to improve communications across services, spanning the institutes, and sort of especially communicate what community wealth building will mean for each service. There is also a need to sort of widen democratic participation in the economy. Local authorities would need more powers to actually carry out some of the approaches that have been mentioned, especially in the theory around this. There also needs to be a better understanding of the kind of barriers and barriers to actually carrying out this approach, some of which are reserve matters, and some of which are sort of, a lot was mentioned around, in some of the people I interviewed, around things such as the European Union's limits on state aid, which I presume Scottish Government wouldn't be keen to remove if you think about the sort of long-term plans by the key parties. There's also a need to sort of reform competitive bidding practices, as has been mentioned by some of the people in the comments today, and I felt like it would just be inappropriate not to mention this. I've not seen been to a surf event where it's not been mentioned, and it is key for sort of community bodies that they would need to be able to make better sort of long-term choices if they had access to consistent, stable funding streams. Yeah, so that's the end of my presentation. I've got my email in here, and if anyone wanted to sort of ask any other questions. But anyway, yes, to the floor. Should I stop sharing my screen?
If you stop sharing your screen, Tim, thank you very much. That was really interesting, and really interesting sort of findings. I mean, I think one of the interesting ones was your survey around local authority awareness within local authorities of community wealth building and the disparity between certain aspects. I suppose, reflecting on our previous conversation from Ashley, presentation from Ashley on 20-minute neighbourhoods, it would also be interesting to ask a similar question across local authorities, internally, their awareness with the recognition that they will only be delivered through a high degree of collaboration. And also, one of the ones I was interested in, one of the slides I was interested in was the greening local construction. And I suppose one of the interesting things that I've come across recently, I went to an event at BEST, the Construction Industry Research Centre, which was around community-led retrofit. At the very end of that, I think one of the things that came up was that one of the people in the room said they felt that the word community and customer were being muddled up, because ultimately community-led retrofit are groups of customers together, and around, even if it's a kick that's doing the retrofit, the community are actually a customer. They're not the people actually delivering the retrofit. So there are interesting things kind of coming out of that. My question for you was actually kind of maybe a bit on your last slide. And obviously competitive bidding, you're right, that sort of stuff, and long-term funding for community groups always comes up. And it came up, we had a meeting with the government yesterday, it came up at that, it came up at our shared learning event last week on creativity and regeneration, the fact that would make a fundamental difference for community regeneration. But I suppose one of your comments was that it's the issue of proven community bodies. in all new policy agendas, so with 20-minute neighbourhoods, we know that middle class communities have grabbed hold of that and are able to use 20-minute neighbourhood policies as a means to say you shouldn't do certain things because we don't like it, and they're resourced and skilled to do that. And with community wealth building, I suppose I'm aware of some well-resourced communities that have also done quite good small-scale regeneration work. I'm thinking of Cooper actually in Fife, but again, it's well-resourced and they're a recognised body. So if we always use proven community bodies for that long-term funding, what do we do about areas where there maybe is an absence of resource or community body, but there's a need?
It's a very good point. I kind of through proven as a sort of way of ensuring that some of the criticisms that I've seen of community bodies in the past has been that lack of experience working with these sorts of assets, and so that's where I went for that. But at the same time, it does need to be a mechanism that would very quickly allow them to scale up. So it's not meant to be a static point. Essentially, it's something that over time, if we can demonstrate that someone's proven themselves, then it would be a bit silly to withdraw their funding at a moment's notice.
Yeah. Which is something we see. I mean, I suppose I can think of two community projects, one near me, one near our office. Recently, they've had about 6 years of government funding, but have now lost it, and it puts them into complete disarray, and they're looking to kind of replace that. But they were doing great community work. First question from Mary.
Thanks, Tim. That was really good. I'm looking forward to reading the detailed research when it's released. Wondering, so my question is, how strong is the alignment with the National Economic Strategy? And by way of context, so I know that the National Strategy is very much focused, or the National Economic Strategy is focused on the national picture. Community wealth building very much focused at the local level, but one is very much driven by the other. And in terms of those sort of principles, and I can see some context, there are some references within NEST around community wealth building, and it says we will develop a community wealth building strategy. But in terms of those sorts of core principles around how we structure the economy and what we're looking to achieve by way of economic growth, how aligned is community wealth building within that national strategy?
It's a very good point. I can't honestly remember where the sort of NEST came into. I was mostly, a lot of the research I did focused a lot on NPF4, and even within that, there seems to be quite a few contradictions between that kind of local policy objectives and national ones. I mean, going into that, there was reference to sort of building new oil infrastructure in the north, even though one of the national spatial goals was to reduce oil infrastructure. So I think there is still that contradiction, and I do wonder if some of the sort of mentions of community wealth building will be got around through viability concerns and other matters such as that. So I have some level of cynicism, which is that I also, I think it remains to be seen, basically.
Having some degree of cynicism is always healthy. And thanks for the question, thanks for the response. Michael, you've got a question.
Yeah, I suppose this is based on some recent experience in the office. We've started to discuss what community wealth building means, and the honest answer is well, there are varying degrees of knowledge, but we're not quite sure. And I suppose it's me that, you know, with this being embedded in NPF4 and a number of other things, that we might need to look at a wee bit more training for planners to kind of understand all these new terms and things that we're supposed to now embed in plans going forward. So it was just to kind of understand if there's been any discussion about additional training for planners to understand exactly what community wealth building means, particularly from a planning perspective. It seems to mean a lot of things to a lot of people, but certainly in my experience in Glasgow, we've started discussing it and how we embed this in plans going forward, but there's not a clear understanding yet of quite how we do that or exactly what it means.
I mean, yeah, I'm not aware of any training at the moment funded for mentioned for it. But yeah, that's basically, I haven't read anything about that level, but it's something I should actually look into for sure. I also just, I guess like the use of it has been intended to be like a framework that is supposed to be a common one throughout Scotland, but I noticed that some other feedback I got was how across different local authorities, they already have a very sort of similar framework for doing certain things that kind of doesn't contradict community wealth building, but it does feel like one that was better suited to the one they were doing. For instance, in Glasgow beforehand, there was the donut economics approach, which seemed to be more the framework they were going with, and then there's been this change. So I do wonder from the Glasgow City Council perspective if that how that sort of has affected your own kind of approach. Does that make sense? Sorry to fire a kind of question back at you.
Sorry, I don't know if it's my connection, but it broke up slightly just in terms of what you were asking. But I kind of missed the question slightly.
Yes, you're breaking up, Michael,
yeah,
for us as well.
To be honest, I think it basically, it was a question about. I know that there were different approaches, sort of holistic ways of viewing sort of policy delivery that different councils have taken. With the connection the way it is, it might not be a bit complicated to try and bring it out, but basically, I do sort of wonder what happens to those ones now that we all have one single sort of policy approach.
Tim had specifically referenced that Glasgow was looking at the donut economic model, and how that is another one. I mean, and I know it's still being live discussed by Glasgow because I was at Glasgow University 2 weeks ago, and I know they were meeting with council officials, and I've met repeatedly with council leaders about how you apply the donut economic model to Glasgow. But I don't know if that has filtered to you, Michael, as another alternative economic model aside from community wealth building.
No, I suppose not directly. I'm aware that there's probably been such a big council, there are lots of different service departments involved in. We specifically have an economic development department, we have community planning section, so there's probably different parts of the council involved in different discussions, and maybe this is an opportunity to try and maybe more closely align that. I suppose I was talking selfishly from a kind of planning perspective as to how we embed it in our planning strategies. But yeah, I mean, obviously in Glasgow, that kind of, we've introduced a level of participatory budgeting. We've got our Centre for Civic Innovation are working on how local people can get more involved in, budget allocations and things like that. So there's lots of different little things or big things happening across the council. I suppose for us, it's kind of understanding how we align that and planning policy and what it means in terms of the evidence that we need to provide, particularly for the development plan that we're undertaking now.
Was that something you came across much, Tim? That, because I suppose to me, there's a well-being economic approach, there's a degrowth approach, there is the donut economics, and we now have community wealth building. So did in your interviews with people, did that potential conflict, or to me, I would say a confusion of a number of different economic approaches, which are all kind of have the same aim, but they're all just doing something slightly differently. Did that cause any confusion within the participants that you interviewed?
I wouldn't say confusion, may be the wrong word, just sort of, I guess it's a case of, this sort of goes back to the sort of irony that lies at the heart of community wealth building, of this being a national policy that's meant to be a local approach. But yeah, I think it's, I guess it's a case of how do you sort of align these things all together. It definitely came up in at least 2 of the interviews off the top of my head, but it was also just there in the literature, particularly kind of, there's one I think Matthew Thompson referenced something about the sort of different municipalist approaches across Europe that were going on, and it's the kind of different ones fit different contexts. I mean, I guess the sort of thing about community wealth buildings is that analysis acknowledges the limitations of local government in the UK quite well, and that's probably why it's something that's being led with. Is there's this sort of understanding that you can't really do as much as you'd like to do because of the limits to powers that local authorities have, and so what's the best we can do? It is this stuff here, and basically that's my understanding of the kind of how the frameworks sort of being is couching itself in a lot of the ways. Yeah, does that answer the question well? I feel like I rambled.
Yeah, no, it does. No, one of the examples even was one that I hadn't come across, the Perth and Kinross community wish list. Was that community benefits that had been filled by local construction, or was it something wider than community benefits?
So it's just within the kind of realm of participatory budgeting, their approach, as I remember, was to take the sort of benefits section of all the people that they procure from, and was to basically they would link this up with another table of community groups who needed certain things, and basically try and align those things together. So the reason, I included it in there because a lot of the outcomes were very place-based, and it was also not just there, but elsewhere it was mentioned as part of the land and property pillar as a kind of area it was. There is definitely a debate of those clusters as to whether or not all of those fall into place-based planning. It's just that I was trying to be more descriptive at that point in the research than, so it is kind of, I'm not 100% sure of it. Yeah, wait, I may have not answered your question properly, so I probably should correct. Does that answer it well?
Sort of. I mean, I'll look into them further because Scottish Procurement Alliance have become sponsors for one of the SURF awards, and they work primarily with housing associations in their procurement policies, and they're very interested in the community benefits. And I'm interested in the role that community wealth building includes community benefits, but sometimes the benefits can be quite small scale things that communities want, and materials for a play park, etc., which is good, and I don't want them to stop. But they're maybe not community wealth building would be one of my questions around small scale community benefits that arise through some procurement processes.
Yeah, it's certainly small scale. I picked on Perth and Kinross mainly because they were mentioned as like one of the good practices in that field as well. But yeah, I hope that answers. Yeah,
it does. No, it does. It's helpful to hear. It's 12:10. I don't see any more hands. I mean, I think one of my comments back to you, and I think you kind of made it, and I don't know if there's anybody from Ayrshire on the meeting today, but the point that the Ayrshire makes as a leader in community wealth building is it only happens if you employ staff to actually lead on this kind of thing. It will only happen in local authorities where there are staff who are doing this as a dedicated part of their job. It won't happen if it's a part of someone's job. It really needs a team of people to make sure that this happens, to enable the local authority to look at its procurement process and to do the thing that community wealth building is based on, and is to foster the grassroots, to rise up to what the government are, you could say, is we're holding out as a goal to change local economic dynamics. But I would agree that the interesting thing about community wealth building is it is supposed to be kind of grassroots, local led, but because it's coming from the top currently, there's a bit of a lag. Which is why local authorities need funding to make sure that it is fostered at the local level. Definitely. Thank you very much, Tim. Thank you very much to everyone else for your questions and your comments. Tim's research will be published on our website at some point in the near future. If Tim's got any amendments he wants to make before, then he's got time, but once it's publicly available, we'll share it with everyone. We'll email it specifically to everyone that's within the People in Place network that you're all meeting on today. So thank you very much, Tim. Look forward to reading the final version of the research, and I think that just leaves us to close our meeting today. We already have another meeting in the diary. I think I can't now remember the date. It's towards the end of July. And
27th of July.
Thank you very much, Emma. And actually, if you go onto our website, you'll probably find we've put in dates for all subsequent meetings, so they're now set for the rest of the year. It tends to be the last Thursday in a month. The next meeting, Paul Eade from Planning Aid Scotland will be talking to about local place plans, partly to introduce some of the PAS work on local place plans, but also to reflect some recent discussions and events that some of us have been looking at, specifically Wester Hailes and Kinning Park's experience in delivering local place plans. But there was a lot of questions at our last meeting with Strathclyde and Foyers at the end of that meeting around local place plans. So we thought this was an opportunity to talk about them a bit more, because obviously they are that could well be key to delivering 20-minute neighbourhoods and the community engagement aspect of that. So we'll look forward to seeing you in July, but more details of that will be coming out shortly. And at that, as if it's sunny where you are, lucky you. In Edinburgh, it's overcast and a bit grey. So no, we're not going out sunbathing for lunch. Derek might, he's in Glasgow, so one of my colleagues might be able to go enjoy it. Yes, it is sunny in Glasgow. But thank you very much this morning and enjoy the rest of your day. And thank you again to Ashley and Tim.